But I think it's great that people are here, and actually you'll see throughout the event at Marxism we've had a series of meetings on the question of racism and Islamophobia, precisely because it's such an important topic that we have to face today. And the reason we're talking about Charlie Hebdo in particular is because when the attacks happened on Charlie Hebdo, if people don't remember, it was back in January, the 7th of January, the people who were shot dead in the Charlie Hebdo offices, including 9 journalists, cartoonists, newspaper workers, whatever you want to call them. Many politicians, both in France and beyond, called this a turning point in the debate on religion and free speech. Now, the attacks on Charlie Hebdo was not the biggest terror attack that we've seen in Europe in recent decades, and I will make some general remarks if I have time at the end about other attacks that have happened and the wider sort of debate around those. However, precisely because the attacks on Charlie Hebdo involved an attack on a newspaper office where there has already been the controversy about their publishing of the controversial anti-Muslim cartoons, it was seen by many commentators as a big attack on the rights to free speech and the rights to criticise and mock religions. And it provoked a whole widespread debate, some of which had been going on already, but it kind of accelerated that debate about the nature of free speech, the role of religion, and the question of racism. And what I want to do really today is to try and unpick some of these ideas and unravel in particular some of the hypocrisies that have been involved and the falsehoods that have been involved in the way that some of these narratives have taken place. And then I want to come on at the end to look at a little bit about the challenges really that I think face us around some of these issues. The first thing to explain is that the cartoons that Charlie Hebdo had published ridiculing the Prophet Muhammad were not just light-hearted mockery. I don't know if any of you managed to come to the meeting yesterday about Charlie Hebdo, where actually we got to see some of the cartoons that they'd printed. These were not just, light-hearted jokes, a bit of a laugh at the expense of some people. These were absolutely obscene images, not just of the Prophet Muhammad, but of Muslim women and of other caricatures of Islamic people, designed absolutely to insult, to degrade, to humiliate. They were very, very offensive cartoons. Now, this isn't to say that this in any way justifies the murder of the people who are involved in that. I'm a Marxist. I'm against individual terrorism on principle. I think it doesn't help our campaign. And I don't think that however obscene and disgusting they were, they in any way justify the attack that took place. But we do have to try and understand why that attack took place and why other attacks take place. And we have to understand why it is those cartoons provoked such anger. And it's not the first time that Charlie Hebdo had published obscene images of the Prophet. In fact, they'd made a bit of a reputation for themselves in doing so. And again, they weren't the first magazine to do so. It had been an ongoing debate since similar anti-Muslim cartoons were published in Denmark, if you remember, 8 years earlier, which were heralded by the right wing, not just as an expression of freedom of speech, but as a brave act of defiance, a proof that they were brave enough to show that they could criticise Islam and criticise religion. And I want to start, really, by talking about what is this free speech that has been bandied around, the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech that is supposed to have become so under attack and has become so entwined with this question of whether or not you can criticise Islam and the question of the cartoons. The first thing I think to say is that there are always limits to free speech. There is no such thing as absolute free speech, quite taken apart from the consensus that exists in society that there may be some things that are completely off limit, the question of child abuse, child pornography, things that people, wherever you stand on the class divide, wherever you stand in society, would generally agree are beyond acceptability. There are always other limits to free speech. For starters, publications make choices all the time about what they print and what they don't print. And even Charlie Hebdo, who held itself up as this great bastion of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, actually believed that some things were unacceptable. So in 2008, they quite rightly sacked a columnist who refused to apologise for an anti-Semitic column that he'd written. So they think there are some things that are acceptable and some things that aren't. They clearly thought there were some limits to free speech. There are all sorts of legal limits to free speech that exist, particularly in the world of the media. The question of copyrights, the question of slander, the question of libel laws, the question of censorship. And if people want to raise questions around censorship, it's quite a big discussion. Actually, censorship laws traditionally have actually been used by the state much more against the left and against, people like gay people than they have in any way against other people. So it's why I'm not actually in favour of censorship, and it's another discussion that we could have. But all of these legal limits do exist, and actually, quite interesting, I don't want people to think that I research my meetings on Wikipedia, but while I was on the internet researching on reputable websites of socialist intent, I did notice that Wikipedia itself is campaigning at the moment to be allowed to use images of modern European buildings without paying, because there's a big attack on their freedom to use particular images of public buildings. So there's always these questions, and one of these big questions is the questions of the vested interests that exist in the media, the ownership and the sponsorship and the advertising that goes into media that influences decisions all the time about what makes it into the pages of different media, what makes it into the press, what actually has the freedom of expression and what doesn't. So these are some of the limits to free speech that exist in our society. There are more sinister limits to free speech. And one of the spin-offs, not just of Charlie Hebdo, but of the whole debate that has emerged from Western governments in response to various terror attacks, including Charlie Hebdo, has actually been an absolute crackdown in the name of freedom of expression and freedom of speech and defending all of these supposed universal values, has actually been a clampdown on the freedom of speech of some of the most oppressed people in our society, including Muslims who are having their freedom of speech and their freedom of expression clamped down on a huge scale. And I'm going to go on to say a bit more about this, but we know that states are keen to clamp down on freedom of expression that exposes them. Why is Chelsea Manning in prison if it's not for exposing and trying to tell people what the security forces were up to? And there are a number of double standards at play here. So the French leaders who responded to the Charlie Hebdo attacks by talking of the sanctity of free speech and democracy and freedom of expression are actually the same leaders of the same French state that actually banned protests in support of Palestine last year, attempted to ban protests in the support of Palestine last year. No freedom of expression if you want to support the Palestinians. And in 2012, it actually banned protests against Charlie Hebdo's previous printing of racist cartoons of Mohammed. So they'd actually banned people protesting openly and legally against these things. They'd stamped down on that previously. And it begs a question about when people have no avenues for protest, where that leaves people and where it leads them. That's another discussion people may want to pick up on. And they're not mindful in the least of the question of freedom of expression and freedom of free speech when they ban Muslim women from wearing their chosen attire in public spaces. The banning of the wearing of the hijab and other items of religious clothing is an absolute travesty of the idea of freedom of expression in the way in which it's used to victimise Muslim women and to tell them that they're not free to express themselves in French society in public. And actually, the journalists at Charlie Hebdo are not the only journalists who faced violence and persecution in the world. There are threats to people fighting for the freedom of expression and the freedom of media, and many journalists actually lose their lives in the line of fighting for those things. And actually, one of the biggest hypocrisies of various state leaders was the march that we saw that took place after Charlie Hebdo, the march so-called for peace and freedom that followed the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, which involved leaders from some of the states that have been the most instrumental in crushing the rights of journalists. People like the Egyptian state, where we know that you can pick up the cards from outside this room about some of the people who've been thrown into jail just for having said things in opposition to the state there. Or leaders from Turkey. Turkey is actually known as one of the leading jail, I think in 2014, last year, was officially the worst state in the world in terms of its treatment of journalists. Or you look at somewhere like Russia, again, somewhere that has a big track record of oppressing journalists. Or the biggest hypocrisy of all, you think, how could such a march, supposedly for peace and freedom, also be headed up by Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, who has not only been responsible for the murders of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, but has specifically targeted, that we know of, 5 media outlets in Gaza, 3 offices of Al-Aqsa TV, 17 journalists killed in the offensive against Gaza last year. So it's absolute hypocrisy to be marching in defence of freedom of expression, headed up by these people who actually have created war, terror, and are quite happy to clamp down on freedom of expression when it doesn't happen to agree with them. So there is no universal free speech. In fact, what we're talking about with Charlie Hebdo and the debates around Charlie Hebdo and more widely are not the question of freedom of speech, but the freedom to insult Muslims and whether or not it's okay to do that. And at the heart of this, we've seen a lot of the much talked about Enlightenment values, the question of French republicanism. There is a separate meeting specifically about Islamophobia and French secularism, so I'm not going to say too much about it, other than actually leaving aside debates about what the Enlightenment and republicanism really stand for, which actually stood for the rights of people to express their religion. They want to separate the religion from the state, but was never originally supposed to be about oppressing, repressing, and denying people the right to express their own religions. But actually, taking aside all of those debates, there are very different attitudes on display depending on what religion we're talking about. So all of the criticisms and the talk of free speech and the talk of Enlightenment values say we defend the right to criticise all religions. We're against all religions. Yet we know that this is not the case in practice. So in France, even as people were marching in the cause of free speech and freedom, more than that, and were marching in defence of the bravery of Charlie Hebdo for publishing the offensive cartoons of the Prophet. Another cartoonist, Zion, was being arrested for cartoons that he had published critical of Judaism in Israel. Now, I don't profess to know anything about his cartoons. I can't pass judgment on them one way or another. My point here simply is that one is seen as criticising religion and seen to be racist and therefore arrestable, and one is seen as a brave act in defiance of some kind of pressure not to criticise religion. And as we know, Charlie Hebdo itself called itself a magazine that attacked everybody, but as I said, didn't tolerate anti-Semitism. Instead, it actually, if you look at the cartoons that it published and you want to think about why they caused so much rage and anger, that's because they aimed their fire at a group of people who in France, more than any other group of people, face racism, persecution and poverty. We were talking about some of this in the meeting last night on Islamophobia, about the huge levels of imprisonment of Muslims in French society, of going to some of the prisons in France around Paris where you will find up to 80% of the people who are in prison. In a country where Muslims are a minority of the population, you will find huge numbers of people in prisons. But these are people who face persecution, poverty, repression. And of course, the right to publish something doesn't mean that you have to. People make choices about this stuff all the time. And as people were saying in the meeting yesterday, the meeting that talked about the question of satire and cartoons, satire should punch up, not down. For something to actually be brave or to be mocking, it should attack the rich, the powerful, the vested interest in society. It should not be attacking the people who are already the poorest, the most discriminated against, the people who are already bearing the brunt of racism and poverty in France. And that is the context in which the cartoons and the debate actually takes place in France today, but right across Europe and beyond. And I want to say something about the question of racism and religion, because I think this is where people tend to get the most confused in the debates about race, religion and free speech. Because one of the interesting things about living in the modern world in which we live today is that most people agree, at least officially, whatever they say in private or whatever they say behind closed doors, that racism is wrong. It's one of the great victories of the struggles against racism of the last century, that people now realise that it's not acceptable to openly say you're a racist, whatever like I said, whatever may be going on in private. And that's why racists are so keen not to be seen as racist. You think about Le Pen in France, who's very keen to say that she's not a racist. She just has ideas about French culture and society and the alien culture of Muslims and all the rest of it. You think about UKIP here, again, have tried to carry a narrative. They're not racist. They're just expressing the feelings of ordinary people. A great effort is gone to for people to say that they're not racist when they are actually expressing views that are racist in the way in which they attack Muslims. And this really is one of the reasons that such a big effort is made by the right to say that the criticism of Islam is not racist. I talked about Le Pen in France or UKIP. You could talk about the English Defence League. You can't really think of a more racist organisation in Britain today, but even they try to pretend that they're not a racist organisation, that they're not being racist to attack Muslims. They're just raising criticisms of a religion. They're criticising cultural differences. They're criticising a failure to integrate. People will be familiar with this kind of rhetoric. And the mainstream parties have given a huge cover to this. You think about the general election that we've just been through, which I have to say is probably the most racist general election I've been through in my lifetime, which has involved all sorts of rhetoric, attacking migrants, attacking Muslims, defending the British way of life, all of these kind of debates that the mainstream parties, including the Labour Party in Britain, have given cover for far too long and have pandered to far too much of these sorts of debates. And when it comes to the left may come from a different starting point to where the right are coming from. You know, generally the far left, the radical left I'm talking about here, the radical left are anti-racist, have been part of anti-racist struggles, do fight against the far right. The left comes from a different starting point, but can often end up in the same place because it accepts the idea that it's okay to criticise all religions, or that people have a duty to criticise all religions. So in France, for example, the main far-left organisation, the New Anti-Capitalist Party, the NPA, in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo's attacks, criticised the attacks and described them as sowing terror against freedom of expression, freedom of the press, in the name of reactionary obscurantist prejudices. Now, there has actually been disagreement over the past few years in the NPA about their attitude towards Muslims, and this isn't the position of everybody in the NPA, but it is a statement that repeats the stereotype of Muslims as having reactionary obscurantist prejudices, of all religion being wrong, about the key question here being the question of the freedom of expression. And this position, shared by most of the French left, which sees religion as inherently reactionary and somehow against the values of modern society, again ignores the racism faced by thousands of Muslims persecuted and marginalised in France and beyond. And this sort of argument that all religions are the problem, that all religions are reactionary, which then becomes a cover in particular for targeting Muslims, is not just something that we've seen in France. You think about the body of work that's grown up in America and in Britain of the kind of militant atheist type approach, the people like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, who've created a whole body of opinion around this that says that the main enemy is religion because religions are all irrational, but in reality it becomes a cover for attacking not all religions but attacking Islam in particular. Or people may have had common sense arguments with other people that they know where this comes out, where people say all religions are bad, religions only give us war and all the rest of it, that all religions are as bad as each other. Now what I want to say is that these sorts of debates misunderstand two things. They misunderstand both the question of racism and the question of religion. And I want to start by just saying about Islamophobia, because actually for years now there has been attempts to deny that Islamophobia actually is racism. I could give you lots of examples of this, and people have probably had their own examples. I'll give you two examples. One of them is the French Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, who had a lot to say actually after Charlie Hebdo, and people might want to talk more about that. But he has previously described Islamophobia as a fabrication by Iranian fundamentalists and described it as a Trojan horse that seeks to destabilise the Republican Pact. Now, his use of Trojan horse, I think, is very interesting. And the more you read about discourse and descriptions of Muslims and people attacking Muslims, the more you will see the recurrence of the theme Trojan horse. You may remember in Birmingham the attacks on the Birmingham schools by an anonymous letter that accused people of Muslims of taking over Birmingham schools for reactionary purposes and all the rest of it, which proved to have no foundation in reality whatsoever. But that was known as Trojan horse. Again, this is Trojan horse. This is a picture that's been created by commentators in the West that sees Muslims somehow as a Trojan horse that are infiltrating Western society. Anyway, it's just something to think about as we pick this up. Another example is Kenan Malik, who 10 years ago wrote probably what is seen as the classic example of this argument that Islamophobia is not racism, the Islamophobia myth, where he said, there is a fundamental difference between race and religion. You can't choose your skin colour, you can choose your beliefs. And he goes on to argue that if it's okay to criticise other belief systems, then why isn't it okay to criticise religion? So I want to explain why Islamophobia is racism in a few basic points. Firstly, racism is not just about skin colour. In reality, race doesn't exist, does it? We all know that race is a construct. But race isn't just about skin colour. It's about discrimination against a group of people based on perceived shared group characteristics. And historically, racism has always changed. As the world in which we live changes, as things are drawn anew, as immigration changes the world, as capitalism changes the world, the targets of racism also change. If you think about the recent history of racism in Britain, which has targeted Irish immigrants, Jewish people, black people coming from Africa and from the Caribbean, Asian people, and now another big target is Eastern Europeans. Again, not to do with skin colour, but to do with their role in the economic system and to do with them being an easy target for racists. And it's not new that a group should be defined by their religion and faced racism. This is exactly what has happened with anti-Semitism. And if I talk quite a lot about anti-Semitism, it's actually because I think the parallels between the way in which anti-Semitism grew up and the way in which anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia, call it what you will today, are very stark, I think. And anti-Semitism involved exactly this same racialising of a group of people with a shared religion. And today, just as with anti-Semitism, this racism doesn't actually depend on how religious somebody actually is in practice. The racism isn't anything to do with what somebody who is a Muslim or somebody who is a Jew during the rise of anti-Semitism, what they actually think, what they actually believe, how far they actually practice. None of it is to do with this. It's to do with them being seen and categorised as part of the same group. And it's not just anti-Semitism. A lot of the anti-Irish racism in the middle to the late 19th century in Britain was also wrapped up with an anti-Catholicism. It's quite interesting if you look at the recent case of Lutfur Rahman, who was the elected mayor in Tower Hamlets, who was removed in basically a judicial lynching from his elected position, partly because he had the temerity, I would say, to have actually challenged some of the rule of austerity in Tower Hamlets. But the judge in the case that ruled that he should be removed from his position as mayor actually repeated and used some of the same stereotypes that existed in the last century about Irish people and Irish Catholics in particular. That when they talked about the Bengali and the Muslim population in Tower Hamlets. In fact, when he talked about a letter from a group of imams that supported Lutfur Rahman, lots of political parties, you will notice, get letters from their supporters. You may have noticed the Tories got letters from various big business partners in the general election. There's nothing strange about that. But the judge ruled that this was exerting undue spiritual influence on the electorate, which is a direct reference to a law that was used against Irish Catholics in the mid-19th century, when the English establishment's racism towards the Irish was bound up with fear of the Catholics. And the judge in Lutfur Rahman's case actually even repeats the stereotype of why this could be a problem, and repeats the stereotype of a passive, ignorant community that's so steeped in tradition that it couldn't possibly think for itself, a stereotype he applied to the Bangladeshi community today, but that was applied to the Irish Catholics in Britain a century ago. And actually, Islamophobia bears all the recognisable features of modern racism. It's based on stereotype. The fact that in Britain pretty much all Asians will be seen as Muslims, all Muslims will be seen as terrorism. There is this slide from one to the other. Actually, you know, lots of Sikhs and Hindus have been attacked or abused or subject to Islamophobia, bizarrely, even though they're not Muslims themselves. It's partly about how this stereotyping spreads out and pulls in a wider layer. And actually, Arun Kundnani, who wrote probably the best book I've read this year on the question of Islamophobia, his book, The Muslims Are Coming, points out that in America, actually common caricatures of Muslims involve Muslims wearing a turban. In other words, Muslims wearing what would be associated with the religious dress of Sikhs. And this is how Muslims are generally caricatured. This shows the level of debate that takes place in some quarters in America. And a key part of the stereotypes of Muslims is the gendered stereotype, isn't it? The stereotype of men are terrorists and women are oppressed seems to be the basic bottom line, that women are seen as in need of rescuing in Afghanistan by Western bombs and in the West by Western laws and by people telling them what they can and can't wear in public or indeed in the home. And so these stereotypes work on a number of levels. Muslims also face other key features of modern racism. They face institutional discrimination and disadvantage. I talked about prisons. You can look at police attitudes. You can look at employment. Now, some of these are obviously to do with ethnicity. Asian people, before the Muslim identity became such a central part of modern racism, faced discrimination in employment and elsewhere. But there is empirical evidence that shows that people who apply for jobs with Muslim names are much less likely to get a favourable response from those things, and these are proved in fact. Muslims also face racist violence. The biggest group of people who face racist violence are actually Muslim women, with people attacking them, pulling off their headscarves. It's disgusting, again, in the name, supposedly, of liberal values and all the rest of it. But racist violence against Muslims has grown, and again, there is documentary proof that after every terror attack, there is some kind of sense from some people of a collective punishment of Muslims with the attacks on people. We saw this after Charlie Hebdo with the sudden spike in attacks on mosques, the firebombing of some mosques, pigs' heads being thrown into Muslim areas, all the rest of it that happened in France. So Muslims also face racist violence just for being Muslims. And as a community and as a group, face suspicion and blame and are seen and portrayed as an alien community who refuse to integrate. Much the same way, actually, as Jews have been talked about in the past in Britain. So anti-Muslim racism combines some of the oldest forms of racism with some of the so-called newer forms of what they call cultural racism, where people don't talk about race, they talk about culture. It's about people's culture as being incompatible with Western values or people not integrating and all the rest of it. I don't want to overstate the divisions between the old forms of racism and the so-called new forms of cultural racism, because the cultural racism stuff has always been a part of how racism has operated. And you think back to 1978 when Margaret Thatcher was talking about how Britain is going to be swamped by those of a different culture. There is a long history of people not just talking about biological racism, but talking about cultural racism as well. And in different countries, the anti-Muslim racism is fused with already existing racisms based on ethnic or geographical origin. So in Britain, a large proportion of the Muslims in Britain are South Asians, so there already was racism against people of Asian origin, and that's kind of been overlaid with this anti-Muslim racism. In France, you can talk about people from North Africa, Algerians in particular. And Muslims are seen today, and I'm going to come on to say more about this at the end, are seen as collectively responsible somehow for the acts that take place by all Muslims. And we know the double standards here. We know that, when there is an act of terrorism, when Andrei Breivik goes and massacres actually far more people in the name of his far-right values, nobody says all white people should apologise for this. Or when a Christian carries out a massacre in America, nobody says all Christians should apologise for this. We know the ridiculous nature of this, but in particular, in the last few years, there has been more and more attempt to say that all Muslims are collectively responsible in some way. And you see this coming from the very top of society. You see this coming from people like David Cameron, who talks about how Muslims have quietly condoned terrorism that has taken place, this constant attempt to make all Muslims somehow responsible for the acts of terrorism that have taken place. And the association of Muslims, in particular with terrorism, that dominates government attitudes to Muslims today, I would say is one of the absolute defining features of how Islamophobia is operating today. So that's Islamophobia and racism. I'm going to come on to say more about what has happened since Charlie Hebdo and how the things are progressing and some of the challenges that we face today. But before that, I just want to say something about religion, because I think it's very important that we try and understand how religions also operate in the modern age, because I think this is part of what leads to the confusion with a whole lot of people on the left. Because religions can't be understood just as free-floating sets of ideas. You can't understand any of the religions that exist in the world just from reading their key texts, because every religion takes on many different forms. You know, you think about Catholicism. Catholicism could be a religion that helped to inspire people to fight to some degree against British rule. It can be an oppressive state religion, and we've seen it take that form at many times throughout history. Or it can be liberation theology in Latin America, inspiring people to fight up and fight to challenge the situation. You think about Christianity in America, which has been central both to some of the most reactionary right-wing forces in America, the Christian fundamentalists, or has actually inspired people like Martin Luther King to fight against oppression and to struggle. And similarly, Islam can't be pinned down as one particular thing. It's used to justify the rule of the Saudis. It's rhetorically used by ISIS to justify its brutality, often against other Muslims, actually, or it can be something that inspires a mass movement in support of Palestine among many people. And the idea that there is something in Islam that is somehow less compatible with modernity is absolute rubbish. It ignores the great contributions that Islamic civilizations and scholars have contributed over the century, including to the Enlightenment and that period of history itself. And I haven't got time to talk about it, but there is more actually in some of the journal articles. But for any religion to survive, it has always had to renew and transform itself. And this is true of all major religions, and this is true of every religion that exists in the world today. And religions don't exist as a floating set of ideas, and they don't exist in a vacuum. They emerge in a social and political context, and they express real things that are happening. And it's funnily enough, it's quite interesting when you look at Marx's writings on this, because people often quote Marx as saying that religion is the opium of the people. In other words, religion is something that dopes people, and therefore we should all be against all religion. This is a totally one-sided view of what Marx actually wrote or thought about religion. Marx wrote, religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless circumstances. And it's only after that he says it's the opium of the people. He was absolutely against writing off religion just as a form of irrationality. He was living at a time of widespread persecution of the Jews, and he argued against other radicals who saw all religions as their main enemy. In particular, Marx wrote a piece called The Jewish Question, in which he argued in support of Jewish emancipation against people who raised very similar arguments, the arguments that we see today, that say all religions are equally bad. People who were radicals and who were saying we're against all religion and therefore we can't support Jewish emancipation because we have to be against all religion. And Marx was against this position. And our position, the position of Marxists, is to understand religion in context and relate to it in the concrete forms in which it exists and which it takes place. And I want to finish really by saying a couple of comments in the concluding minutes about what's happened after Charlie Hebdo. Because the response from governments across Europe, in France and beyond, since Charlie Hebdo, has been an absolute ratcheting up of Islamophobic rhetoric and repressive legislation. So the French state and the French political class talked about defence of freedom of expression and all of those things, but it rushed through a new surveillance law straight in the wake of Charlie Hebdo, just as the Tories have rushed through new anti-terror laws this year that increase police and security services power. And there is a draconian attack going on at the moment, an attack on freedom of speech and expression underway that has been justified bizarrely, in an Orwellian twist really, in no small part by the need to respond to the attack on Charlie Hebdo, supposedly, and the need to defend the right to freedom of speech by destroying freedom of speech. It's both sinister and strange, and if it wasn't so frightening, it would be laughable, but it's not laughable, unfortunately. In the weeks that followed the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, in the 3 weeks that followed the attacks, there were 257 arrests for people who were accused of condoning or provoking terrorism. Again, you can read more about the examples of that in the journal article in here. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them was a 14-year-old girl who was investigated for condoning or provoking terrorism after she told a ticket inspector on public transport that she would get out the Kalashnikovs if they asked to see her ticket. One of them was a man with learning difficulties who was given a 6-month sentence after shouting, "They killed Charlie, I laughed," when he was drunk. The guy was drunk when he said this, and he was given a 6-month sentence for it. An 8-year-old boy and his father were reported to the police after the boy said, "I am with the terrorists," in the context of an argument that had taken place, even though when he was questioned, it turned out he didn't even know what a terrorist was, but he was reported to the police for this. This was the level of suspicion and crackdown that happened in the wake of Charlie Hebdo. But this is not just a question of France. This is the sort of thing that is increasingly starting to spread into legislation here in Britain. The question of glorifying terrorism is already an offence in Britain, and we have already seen a rise in people who are convicted not for doing anything, but for owning pamphlets or videos, or for things that they've posted on Facebook. And we have also seen in the last month the implementation in law of the Prevent strategy, which will make it a legal duty for people who work in education, in the health service, in councils, in prisons, to basically to spy on people for so-called evidence of radicalisation. And when you look into some of the guidance, actually there is guidance has been issued for childminders of children as young as 4 of how to spot radicalisation in children and how to report this. And you have a legal duty now to report this if you spot I don't know how you spot a sign of radicalisation in a 4-year-old. But this is absolutely, actually in the health service there's been guidelines offered for optometrists. So you go and have your eyes checked, and if you think that your optician is looking in your eyes a little bit closely, then maybe they're looking for signs of radicalisation. This is frightening stuff that is intruding into all areas of civil society and all areas of our life. And we know why it's happening. It's happening because our politicians are determined that there will not be a proper debate about what causes violence and what causes terrorism in the world. And we saw it again with the anniversaries of 7/7, where Tony Blair was rolled out doing interview after interview saying that actually 7/7 had nothing to do with the foreign policy of Britain or America. It had nothing to do with the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. It had nothing to do with the murder of Palestinians. And this is exactly what has been said about every terror atrocity that has happened. This attempt to break the link between the foreign policy, the things that make people so angry and so upset that they might think that they would be better off living in Syria than living in Britain, where they face racism and persecution and now being driven from the ability to express their thoughts and have any freedom of expression. And so the response to every attack coming from the politicians, from the top of society, has been over the last decade, that either to say that there is something intrinsically wrong with Islam, that Islam has the seeds of violence, it hasn't had an enlightenment, it's a brutal religion, all of these, people know the stereotypes, or to say this is not the real Islam, but the real Muslims need to denounce it and apologise for it and say that it's not them and it's not their fault. And some of the politicians, like Cameron, seem to manage both, where he says extremely sinister things like, we have been passively tolerant for far too long. Now, what does that mean? That we need to become more intolerant, at the same time as pushing through, we have to adhere somehow to British values of tolerance and liberalism, all the rest of it. At the same time, he wants us to be less tolerant towards Muslims. And there is a big push, I think, at the moment, that you think about the Trojan horse thing in Birmingham, you think about what happened to Lutfi Rahman in Tower Hamlets, this attempt to push a layer of Muslims out of public life at the same time as, I think, a growing body of thought that links opposition to what they call British values to the question of radicalisation and a massive crackdown that's taking place at the moment on people, not people who've done anything, but people who may be seen to hold the wrong sorts of ideas. Now, we're at Marxism, and there are hundreds of us here who hold what they think are the wrong sorts of ideas. And if we have time about this, well, we can talk about this more later, but something very sinister is happening now. In the name of defending freedom of speech, the right to criticise religion and all the rest of it, our governments are cracking down on actually our real freedoms of speech and our real freedoms of expression. And I think we have a duty to stand together, black, white, Muslim, non-Muslim, Jewish, atheist, all the rest of us, to say we will not allow them to isolate the Muslims in Britain. We will not allow them to drive a wedge between Muslims and people who are not Muslims. We will not allow them to attack people in a racist manner in the name of any ideology they want to call it. We will not allow this to happen in Britain. We have a proud tradition of fighting the fascists, of standing together in the Stop the War movement, of working together on a whole number of issues, and we will not allow this form of racism to take root in this society, and we will not let them get away with it.
Hi, I work in children's social care in Cheshire, and I've noticed that recently social workers have been told that they need to look at radicalisation as a child protection issue, but they're not talking about people who are brought in by groups like the BNP and stuff like that. You know, that's not counted, it's just radicalisation of Muslims and stuff like that. We talk about most things at work, and this meeting is helping me sharpen up my arguments, because I sometimes need to challenge what the ideas that people come out with. And this is sort of taking me back to growing up as a child in Bermondsey, when people used to think it was acceptable to crack jokes about Irish people, black people, Jewish people, and if you challenged it, they used to say that you had no sense of humour and stuff like that, and, you know, why can't you see it's just a joke? You know, and it wasn't acceptable then, and it's not acceptable now. Just thought as well, the attacks in Tunisia recently, there wasn't much publicity about hotel workers who risked their lives to help tourists, you know, but there was a lot of publicity about the attacks on the tourists. I feel like the words freedom of speech and expression are being abused, as Esme said, to suit the people that are using them. And to do with freedom of speech, I remember at a UAF conference a few years ago, I was at a meeting about why we say no platform for the Nazis, and a young black woman put it very simply in a few words: why we say no platform. She said, nobody's got the right to debate whether my right to exist, and that for me says it all, really. I think the attacks are wrong, I don't think they work, but I also understand why they happen, what the cause of them is, and I'm completely opposed to racism and Islamophobia.
Nias Fires from Ealing SWP branch. To answer Esme's initial question in terms of why I'm here rather than at the Greek meeting, one is because it's packed to the rafters. There's no room in the inn; it's standing room only. But also because I, as a Muslim, I have a particular, as well as a revolutionary member, a member of the SWP, I have a particular take on this particular question, and it's a very important issue to my own heart. In terms of sort of like Islamophobia, I mean, this issue really came to my mind, and I had to make a decision as to whether or not I was a Muslim, as well under the issue of the Satanic Verses and the book that was done by Salman Rushdie. And I remember then that people on the left in this country, including people on the Labour left, were critical and did not support Muslims over the question of saying that the book was wrong. Certainly, I didn't agree with those that said that Salman Rushdie should be killed, but I did feel that very strongly that the book was wrong, and I did feel that it was right to protest against what is, frankly, a grotesque book, supposedly done by a Muslim, but not anymore, as far as I'm concerned. That leads me really on to what Esme was talking about in terms of sort of like militant atheism. And I had to deal with this on Twitter from none other than Polly Toynbee. When I said to her, and I reminded her that she was the one that said in an article in The Guardian that she was proud to be an Islamophobe. And I said, get stuffed. Because I said, quite frankly, you may say that you are against all religion, but what people remember from what you said in the article in The Guardian is the fact that you're an Islamophobe. And that leads me on to what's going on in terms of people going from this country to go to Syria. Because it's sort of like I've just discovered that my family, who also live in Luton, know of the family of 12 that have gone from Luton via Istanbul into Syria. And I wanted to sort of like give my take as to why I think they're going. Firstly, it's because of the rising tide of Islamophobia, which has seen, for example, people, women sort of like asserting the fact that they are Muslims by wearing the hijab. And that's a discussion that I had earlier this morning. But also, it's because, as Esme quite rightly points out, it's because of the racist and filthy and disgusting foreign policy of this government and of other European governments and of the American government, starting with Iraq and continuing with Afghanistan, and also in terms of support for Israel over Palestine. But also, I think it's because people are fed up and they want an alternative. And if they can't find an alternative here, they think that that paradise will be sort of like going to Syria and following ISIS. But that is not true. And that's where the Marxist analysis comes in that we need to fight for a better world in this country and globally. Thank you very much.
I'll take the woman over here in the red.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else, I assume people probably did have this experience after the Charlie Hebdo attacks when people were sort of talking to you about it and you sort of said, well, I don't think it's okay to, shoot people in that way. Actually, it was a racist magazine and they'd go, don't you believe in freedom of speech? And you'd be like, well, yeah, I do. But I think what I have to say is that what we mean by freedom of speech is completely actually different to what sort of Western leaders mean when they talk about freedom of speech. Because if you see people like, David Cameron, he'll defend the right of sort of journalists in France to draw offensive cartoons about Western Europe's most like vilified religious minority, while at the same time saying that Muslims that don't sort of spend their whole time condoning ISIS are in fact quietly condoning them. And, if you sort of criticise the West, then, the same thing, you're giving credence to extremism. So, we're seeing it now. If you're a Muslim and you stand up for Palestine or you oppose the bombing of Iraq and Syria, that's apparently, extremism now. And not just that, if you're a 6-year-old kid who makes some sort of comment about not celebrating Christmas, or you're a young Muslim who starts wearing religious dress, apparently now that's extremism. But I think the reason this is important is when our rulers say freedom of speech, what they mean is the freedom to demonise Muslims, and not just Muslims. They also mean the freedom to make comments like the ones David Blunkett made about Roma people. They mean the freedom of people like Katie Hopkins to call migrants cockroaches and say we should just leave them all to drown in the Mediterranean. And I think what we have to say is that as socialists, what we mean by freedom of speech is that we mean the freedom of Muslims and other people to attack Western imperialism and to resist their oppression. And the freedom to fight against austerity and for a different kind of world. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Rich from Bristol. Towards the end about this, technically, we can only just call it thought crime. I remember growing up in the 1980s, if anyone spoke to you about Russia, Russia's nasty. It's got spies. It's got cameras, what you like, the Stasi, and people recruit you and they spy on you and they tap your phones and they always know what you're doing. And as soon as that Berlin Wall came down, the CCTV cameras went up. It was like everything that they were saying about how nasty Russia was because it spies on you, our state started to do. Britain became awash with CCTV cameras. And then we got this idea of basically thought police. You police people, you're like, are you thinking wrong thoughts? What are you going to have next? Room 101 or something to sort of make sure you got the right ones or something. And you're thinking, this is straight out of 1984. And you're wondering where do they get off on this? And of course you've got to think they want to retain their power. At the end of it, it's not just against Muslims; it's against the working class. It's against what defines radicalism. Where's the bar? Trying to say, oh, yeah, terrorism's good, or shall we go on strike? Where's this bar? It's a thin edge of the wedge. And again, another side of it, it's like kicking the hornet's nest. It's self-fulfilling prophecy. If you keep poking a hornet's nest and kicking it around, don't be surprised if they sting you. So if you've got a whole layer of media attacking and bullying a section of society, don't be surprised if they react. And we've got to turn around and say, well, it's been provoked for long enough. We've been waiting for a reaction of some sort. I think it goes down to the real idea of freedom of speech. As stated at the beginning, you attack the powerful with freedom of speech. That was the purpose of it in the 18th century. It wasn't this idea to just basically insult the poor, insult the oppressed. And really, you've got to ask yourselves, can you really have freedom of speech in a land of inequality, where you've got media giants that own big corporations of televisions, of newspapers, of films, etc., etc., etc. This is how they influence your thoughts. This is here is where we influence our thoughts and to argue with other people. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Followed by...
Yeah, I really agree with what... Sorry, I forgot your name. Esme said. And I think that we need to just start adding two and two together and realizing how radicalization, like the real radicalization actually happens and how extremism builds up. Because if Muslims for the most part are just in Western society are just shunned, isolated, bullied, discriminated against, whatever, you name it. And why should they work really, really hard to be defending a society which at best just tolerates them? They shouldn't have to work to be tolerated. They should just be They should just be loved for like who they are and actually welcomed, because this is absolutely ridiculous. And see people like cracking jokes about in the name of satire and free speech is absolutely ridiculous. If it's going to be free speech, it's free speech for everyone, not just for a certain group of people.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just on people who like to say that they're just critical of Islam when it is that they're attacking Muslims. I mean, I don't really call it satire to attack some of the most powerless people at the minute, some of the most vulnerable, some of the people who are actually the most marginalised inside the communities that we live in. Because if you look at where Muslims lie in Britain at the minute, they're overrepresented in the prison system and underrepresented in things like jobs, like decent homes, in the sort of like qualities which we've got in life. But I mean, so there's a difference between really attacking people who have power and attacking people who don't as well. But this whole hypocrisy of free speech, if you look to France, where it is that they're like, the proponents of free speech, of liberalism, of, republicanism, all that sort of stuff. But these are the same people who banned pro-Palestine demonstrations last year when Israel was bombing Gaza. The same people who ban women from wearing headscarves and who work in like the public sector, and people who allow people who wear a headscarf to get attacked in the streets on a regular basis without actually standing up for their freedom of speech. But I mean, I just want to say something about the murder of Lee Rigby as well, because it was straight after the murder of Rigby, really, where it's been the only real time in London when I've actually felt genuinely scared that I might at any point be attacked by someone right-wing or like a fascist or something like that. And it was even a time when my dad rang me up just to make sure that like everything was going all right, because obviously I'm not from London, I'm from Teesside, like so on my own a bit down here. But what I felt was instantly that isolation, that sort of scared feeling, like there's nobody there who's actually able to physically protect you at any time for if something like this was to happen, and you suddenly felt like everyone was your enemy. But then I went out on the Unite Against Fascism demonstrations the week after when the EDL tried to lay wreaths around the country at all these different places. And I went out to those demonstrations and I found that there were thousands of other people who were actually willing to stand side by side against the reactionary views that the EDL, that people were trying to use this murder to actually propagate. And really that showed the sort of possibility of where actually change can come from, when people get together like that and actually show where the resistance is at.
Thanks a lot. This will be our last...
Thank you. My name is Safia and I come from Birmingham, originally from France. Funny enough, when there was this attack in Paris, I had a phone call from my mom. Now, she never calls. I was in England. She knew I was in England, but she called anyway. And she was a bit worried, and I said to her, she said, oh, there is this terrorist attack. And I thought, this is weird. Why is she calling me? I'm in England. And okay. And I said, well, I was fine. And then after that, I had a few people coming to me and saying, oh, what's happening is because of the way French people are handling the Muslim situation. And I was thinking, what do you mean? It's about secularism, actually. I think the way I understand secularism, sorry, I can't pronounce it, is far, far different from what you understand. And I'm quite worried about people criticizing freedom of speech, because I have a question actually, which is, so what is the alternative if we're talking about, I don't want to hear censorship, I'm worried about that. So I just don't know. I'd like to have freedom of speech. I don't agree with what Charlie Hebdo publicized. I've never bought any of their magazines. I have seen some of the caricaturists, and I was really shocked. But I'm thinking, well, that is what they do. They're just, humorists, and I don't agree. That's fine. And I just want to know, what is the alternative, if not censorship? I'm worried about censorship, I must say. I am.
Paul, I'll try and answer a couple of questions and then just make a couple of general comments. The woman from Birmingham, France, who asked about secularism and censorship, what I mean by secularism, and in one sense I would call myself a secularist, in that I think there should be a division between the church and the state. I don't think our government should dictate to us about having Christian assemblies. When I was a kid, I withdrew myself from Christian assemblies because I don't see why my education should be dominated by one particular religion. In that sense, I think socialists should be secularists. However, when secularism becomes used as a cover for persecution of a religious group, for me that is not the tradition of secularism. Secularism should be about ensuring the freedom of expression of religion to all religions, and particularly to the religions who are the most persecuted and the most marginalised. And therefore I think there has been a perversion of the term secularism, whereby it has become a cover for Islamophobia and a cover for targeting Muslims in particular. So that's what I mean by secularism. When it comes to censorship, you see, I agree with you. I'm not in favour of state censorship. As I said earlier, state censorship, like you, I find it quite hard to say state censorship, has traditionally been used to attack the left or to attack people who speak out against the so-called norms of society. People, you think about the novels that have been banned of D.H. Lawrence and all the rest of it. You think about how censorship laws in Britain have been used to target gay bookshops or the gay press. Actually, when the state uses censorship, the state uses it for means that we do not agree with. And actually, even when it comes to difficult things like Charlie Hebdo, I'm not actually in favour of state censorship of these things. At the moment, there are some journalists in Turkey who are on trial for having republished the disgusting front cover of Charlie Hebdo, a front cover that I'm absolutely appalled and disgusted by, and I think it is no act of bravery, it is an act of racism to print that. But I do not trust the Turkish state on the question of justice and dealing fairly with the question of journalists. I don't. I don't trust them because of what they've done already and the people that they throw in jail for that. But there is an alternative to censorship from the state. And actually people in France did try to have protests, political protests against the Charlie Hebdo cartoons in 2006, but they were banned by the French state. There is an alternative to censorship from the top, and that is creating a movement from below that says these images are not acceptable, they are racist, we will not tolerate them. And those have to be demonstrations, black and white, Muslims and non-Muslims. We cannot leave Muslims alone to fight over the attacks that Muslims are facing. It would be a travesty and an abandonment of the duty of any left-wing radical free-thinking, right-minded person to leave the group of people who are facing racism to face that alone. So there is an alternative. In fact, there's an alternative to this whole cycle of repression, terror, repression, terror. The problem with this is that every time there is more repression, funnily enough, if you don't allow people to have the freedom to express themselves, to have political demonstrations, to protest openly over the question of Palestine and all the rest of it, what do they think happens when you drive people more and more away from places they can have collective expression into places where they feel personally isolated and repressed? That's where you see an escalation of terror, in my view. And there has to be an alternative to that cycle of violence. And the alternative is to admit that there are some central causes to this. And this is where the anti-terror thinkers go wrong completely. And there has now been a whole industry set up around the question of how to deal with the question of radicalisation and terrorism and all the rest of it. And funnily enough, that whole industry is built on the notion of denying that there are material causes that create terror in the world. And for me, it just seems, it flies in the face of living in the world in which we live, to say that the attacks that happened in 7/7 or the bombings in Madrid or the Charlie Hebdo had nothing to do with the plight of the Palestinians, the Iraqis, the people of Afghanistan who have seen their families murdered, their homes destroyed, their water supplies ended, people thrown in Abu Ghraib, people thrown in Guantanamo Bay. When these things happen, and Marx himself talked about, there is something in history called retribution, where violence is caused, I can't remember the quote, but violence is caused not by this violence is started somewhere, and it is started by Western imperialism. And then Western imperialism creates such havoc, destruction, and misery that it creates a blowback in the form of terrorism. But there is a massive attempt to deny that by the people who are politicians, policy makers, and the media. And instead they try to tell us that radicalisation is about people who have picked up bad ideas, often at the age of 3 or 4, have picked up bad ideas or have picked them up as teenagers because they go on the internet too much in their bedroom, you know, like every other teenager who goes on the internet in their bedroom, but have picked up bad ideas somewhere along the line, and that somehow bad ideas lead to bad thoughts, lead to non-violent extremism, lead to violent extremism. It's a conveyor belt on which Muslims seem to have set off from the age of 4, if you would believe the policymakers. And this is no serious way to try and understand the things that are happening that are shaping people's lives. And actually, if we want to make the world a safer place, we have to try and break that cycle, and we have to try and break through the silence that is trying to crush the idea that terrorism is caused by the offensive nature of Western imperialism. And we have to try and name the central cause in all of this. And I think that just brings me to my final points, really, is the stuff that's happening in Britain today is an attack not just on Muslims, it is an attack on everybody who wants to dissent to what the government is doing and what Cameron has in store for us. And, you know, part of the Prevent stuff that has just come into law is they have a subsection called Channel, which Channel is the de-radicalisation programme that they run under Prevent, where they identify people who are supposedly at risk of radicalisation, and then they put them through a programme where they somehow are supposed to change their minds and get them off the path of radicalisation. And we know that up until from 2007 to 2010, there were 1,120 people, including 55 under 5-year-olds and 290 under 16-year-olds, put through this programme. And we don't know much about most of them. Funny enough, this is all done in secret, and you don't know much about any of them, really. We know about one of them because one of them actually has spoken out and has spoken to researchers and is discussed in Anne Kandlani's book. And that is the case of a young man who was a teenager in Manchester who went to a pro-Palestinian demonstration at his local university. And because of a mixture of that, and one of his parents was a Muslim, even though he didn't call himself a Muslim, he was reported and put on the Channel programme. And for 2 years, police visited him, his aunt, his family, his school. When his school organised the trip to take people to the Tory party conference, they visited his school and said he shouldn't go on it because he has to be isolated from all sorts of political ideas. And they tried to persuade him to stop mixing with the people who he was hanging out with and to start breaking with those alliances. Now, the people that he was mixing with, they wanted him to break with, were not actually extremist Muslims. They were members of the Socialist Workers' Party that he'd met when he was protesting over Palestine. So you can see how something that is aimed at Muslims becomes something that much more widely becomes about clamping down on people who have the temerity to challenge what the government is about. My final point is this, is somebody talked about what we did in Britain after the Lee Rigby murders, and we did go on the streets and we did protest against the EDL and over the fascists to say we are not going to allow these murders, which were horrific murders, but we're not going to allow these murders to be used to ramp up Islamophobia in Britain. And one of the best stories that I heard about that was not about the big demonstrations that we went on, but actually members of the Socialist Workers' Party and some of our supporters did much smaller stalls in shopping centres across Britain where people put up, you know, you've probably seen it, the pace table that sags in the middle, the little petition boards, the stopping people outside tube stations. And somebody told me from West London that they had done a stall over this and they'd been petitioning to say no to Islamophobia in the wake of the murder. Don't let the murder be used to ramp up Islamophobia in Britain. And they said that a family of Muslims went past and just wrote a little note on a piece of paper, gave it to their son who brought to the stall, who gave it to the people who were just petitioning on their saggy pace table. And the message said, "Thank you. It's people like you who make us feel good about living in Britain." And that's what I mean about we can't let people be isolated. We cannot let Muslims fight this fight alone. This is a fight for all of us. We stand together against the war. We stand together against all of in defence of Palestine. We stand together against racism. And we have a battle ahead of us, I think, to fight austerity and to fight alongside each other. And the fight against austerity can make us feel stronger in the fight against racism, but the fight against racism can also make us feel stronger in the fight against austerity. We have to bring all of these things together, and we have to create a powerful bulwark against what the Tories are trying to do and what the politicians across Europe are trying to do that is ripping up people's lives.